The room was silent, save for the rhythmic humming of the air conditioning that fought against the Ouagadougou heat. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath. Across the mahogany table sat a man who looked like a brother, a leader from the Caribbean, a face that reflected the shared heritage of the Black Atlantic. But in the eyes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, there was no recognition of kinship, only the cold, sharp calculation of a soldier who knows he has walked into an ambush. The visitor smiled, a practiced expression honed in the diplomatic salons of Paris and the corridors of Brussels. He slid a single folder across the polished wood. Inside, there were no declarations of war, no threats of sanctions, and no demands for surrender. Just a proposal. A partnership, the text claimed. But history has a way of teaching the vigilant to read between the lines, and what Traoré saw in that moment was not an offer of aid. It was a price tag. For decades, this has been the ritual. A messenger arrives, draped in the flags of international cooperation, carrying promises wrapped in the language of development. They speak of stability. They whisper of integration. Yet, the soil beneath their feet tells a different story. A story of minerals extracted by foreign hands, of fertility sold to distant markets, leaving behind nothing but dust and debt. This meeting was supposed to be different. It was billed as a dialogue between the diaspora and the motherland, a bridging of the ocean that once swallowed millions. But as the Caribbean leader began to speak, his voice smooth and reassuring, the air in the room shifted. He was not speaking for himself. The words were his, but the cadence belonged to masters sitting thousands of miles away. He spoke of moderation. He spoke of rejoining the international fold. He spoke of the dangers of isolation. It was a performance, flawless and seductive, designed to make submission look like wisdom. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this story resonates, show your support with a like, a comment, or a subscription. It means more than numbers. It keeps the story alive. What happened next is the reason we are telling this story today. Usually, in these closed-door meetings, the script is followed. The African leader listens, nods, accepts the terms, and the cycle of dependency is renewed for another generation. The cameras outside wait to capture the handshake, the smiles, the joint communiqué that says everything is fine, while the sovereignty of a nation quietly bleeds away. But Ibrahim Traoré did not nod. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, hands that are calloused, not from signing treaties, but from holding the weight of a fracturing nation. He looked at the folder, then at the visitor. And then, for a long, uncomfortable minute, he looked at the camera recording the official minutes of the meeting. It is said that in that silence, the Caribbean leader's smile began to falter. The rehearsed lines about mutual prosperity died in his throat. Because he realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was not speaking to a politician who could be bought with a seat at the high table. He was speaking to a man who had already decided that if the table was not set by his own people, he would rather eat on the floor. But here is the detail that few have spoken about. The detail that transforms this from a diplomatic spat into a defining Ibrahim Traoré moment. Sources close to the palace suggest that this meeting was not just being recorded for the archives. There is talk of a second recording, an audio tape that captures what was said after the official cameras were turned off. In that unscripted exchange, the diplomatic mask reportedly slipped entirely. The polite suggestions of partnership were replaced by something far darker. A stark, naked warning about what happens to nations that dare to walk alone. We do not yet have the full transcript of that hidden conversation. But we know the effect it had. It was meant to instill fear, to remind the young captain of the fate of those who came before him, of Sankara, of Lumumba, of the many who refused to kneel and paid for it with their blood. The visitor thought he was delivering a lesson in reality. He thought he was explaining the rules of the game to a novice player. To understand why this matters, we must look at who was sitting across from him. This Caribbean leader, whose name we will withhold for now, focusing instead on what he represents, is a figure celebrated in the West. He is toasted in London, praised in Washington, cited as a model of sensible governance. He wears the skin of the oppressed, but speaks with the tongue of the oppressor. He is the perfect intermediary, the comfortable face of an uncomfortable truth, that the chains of empire are no longer made of iron, but of debt, diplomacy, and the soft, suffocating pressure of international consensus. He came to Ouagadougou believing that Traoré was isolated. He believed that the sanctions were biting, that the pressure was breaking the spirit of the junta, and that a way out would be grabbed with both hands. He did not understand the soil he was standing on. Burkina Faso is not just a country. It is a memory of dignity that has been awakened. When you plant a seed in dry earth, it waits. It endures the heat, the thirst, the trampling feet. But when the rain finally comes, it does not ask for permission to grow. It bursts forth. Traoré is not the rain. He is the result of the rain. He is the harvest of decades of frustration that has finally ripened into resolve. However, the visitor had one final card to play. Beyond the threats and the offers of money, there was something else in that folder. A piece of intelligence, or perhaps a manufactured crisis, designed to force Traoré's hand immediately. It was a specific piece of leverage concerning the security situation on the northern border, a piece of information that only a partner with deep satellite networks could provide. The implication was clear. Work with us, and we help you secure your borders. Refuse, and you are blind. It was a cruel choice. The safety of his people versus the sovereignty of his nation. A pragmatist would have taken the deal. A politician would have negotiated the terms. The air in the room grew heavy. The Caribbean leader leaned forward, waiting for the capitulation. He expected the captain to ask about the terms, to ask about the funding, to ask how to sign. Instead, Traoré reached out. He did not open the folder. He did not call for his advisors. He placed his hand on top of the document, a heavy, decisive weight, and slowly, deliberately, pushed it back across the table. The sound of the paper sliding across the wood was louder than a shout. It was the sound of a bridge burning. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on 500 years of history. The visitor blinked, stunned. "Captain," he reportedly stammered, his composure cracking. "You do not understand the consequences of what you are doing. You are choosing darkness." Traoré's reply was not immediate. He let the word darkness hang in the air, tasting its irony. Then, he looked the envoy in the eye, and with a voice that was terrifyingly calm, he delivered 6 words that would turn the meeting and the geopolitical chessboard upside down. 6 words that we will reveal in a moment. Because they did not just end a conversation. They started a revolution. We do not fear the dark. 6 words. Simple, quiet. Yet they landed with the weight of a gavel sentencing an era to death. The Caribbean leader stared, his mouth slightly open, the slick arguments dying on his tongue. He had expected anger. He had expected negotiation. He had expected the frantic bargaining of a man cornered by sanctions and scarcity. But he had not expected this. a refusal so absolute that it did not even leave room for a maybe. We can now reveal what was likely in that rejected folder. Based on similar agreements signed by other nations in the region, the document was almost certainly a comprehensive stabilization package. On the surface, it offered hundreds of millions in immediate liquidity, money to pay soldiers, to subsidize fuel, to keep the lights on in Ouagadougou, but the fine print? That is where the trap lay. The money was conditional. It required the restructuring of the mining code for allowing foreign giants to keep 90% of the profits. It required the acceptance of technical advisors in the military, code for foreign spies in the war room. It was not a lifeline. It was a leash. Traore knew this. He knew that signing that paper would turn the lights on in the capital for a year, but it would extinguish the fire of sovereignty forever. By pushing it back, he was not just rejecting money. He was rejecting the very premise that Africa needs permission to survive. This moment forces us to ask a difficult question, one that echoes across the Atlantic. Why send a Caribbean leader? Why choose a man with black skin, whose ancestors were stolen from these very shores, to deliver the empire's ultimatum? The answer lies in the cynical genius of modern neocolonialism. They know that a white envoy lecturing an African soldier looks too much like the 19th century. It stirs the wrong kind of memories. It looks like a master scolding a servant. But a black envoy? That looks like brotherly advice. It looks like concern. It is a mask worn to hide the face of the system. History is a mirror, and if you look closely, you have seen this scene before. During the era of slavery, there were always two kinds of figures on the plantation. There was the one who worked the field from dawn till dusk, feeling the lash, dreaming of rebellion. And there was the one who stood on the porch, well-fed, well-dressed, whose job was to keep the field workers calm, to tell them that the master was kind, that freedom was dangerous, that the darkness outside the plantation gates was something to be feared. The visitor in that room was the man on the porch. He had come to tell Traore that the field, the path of independence, of struggle, of self-reliance, was too hard. He had come to say, "Come back to the house. The food is better here. The master will forgive you." But Traore is not looking for forgiveness. He is looking for the future. He understands that the comfort of the house is bought with the blood of the field. And he knows that the man sitting across from him, despite the shared melanin, represents a system that has fundamentally different interests from the people of Burkina Faso. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to Traore, to Burkina Faso, or to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality. It is recognition. It is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video. You are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and pride. So before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. The tension in that room was thickened by ghosts. You cannot sit in the presidential palace of Burkina Faso without feeling the presence of Thomas Sankara. 40 years ago, he too sat in rooms like this. He too was offered aid that was really poison. He too refused. And because he refused, because he could not be bought, they killed him. The Caribbean envoy knew this history. His presence was a subtle reminder of it. The unspoken threat hanging in the air was simple. Look what happened to the last man who said no. But here is the difference. When they came for Sankara, the people were asleep, lulled by the belief that the revolution was safe. Today, the people are awake. Traore is not just a captain. He is a conduit. The man across the table was trying to intimidate an individual, forgetting that he was facing a collective. You can assassinate a man. You cannot assassinate a generation that has already decided it would rather die on its feet than live on its knees. And yet, there is a deeper layer to this encounter that most analysts have missed. Why this specific Caribbean leader? There are dozens of diplomats they could have sent. Why him? Intelligence reports suggest a far more personal reason for his selection, a reason that turns this political theater into a personal tragedy for the envoy himself. It turns out, his political survival back home hangs by a thread. He was not just sent to pressure Traoré. He was sent to prove his own loyalty to the powers in Paris and Washington. If he failed here, if he came back empty-handed, his own position would crumble. He was not just a messenger. He was a hostage of the same system he was trying to sell. This brings us to the most striking paradox of the meeting. As the conversation continued, the dynamic in the room began to invert. The visitor, the elder statesman, the man with the stable democracy and the Western backing, began to look small. He shifted in his seat. His arguments sounded hollow, even to his own ears. He was speaking of global stability and economic integration, fancy words for submission. Traoré, the young soldier, the pariah, the man supposed to be trembling in the dark, sat with the composure of a mountain. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply laid out the facts of what his people were building. The refineries, the agriculture, the alliances with partners who treat them as equals. He was educating the educator. He was showing the man from the porch what true freedom looks like. And then, as the meeting neared its end, Traoré leaned in again. He didn't offer a compromise. He didn't ask for a second chance. He looked at the envoy, a man trapped in a golden cage, and asked him a single question. A question so piercing, so unexpected, that reports say the envoy did not answer. He couldn't. Because to answer it, he would have to admit that he, not Traoré, was the one in chains. What did Traoré ask? The answer will change how you see every diplomatic mission sent to Africa from this day forward. Brother, are you free? Traoré did not ask about the envoy's president. He did not ask about the terms of the loan. He asked a question that cut through the layers of protocol and touched the human bone beneath the suit. Brother, are you free? Or are you just the one who holds the pen while another hand guides the stroke? The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. The envoy, a man who had debated in the United Nations and dined with prime ministers, had no answer. He shifted his papers. He adjusted his tie, but he could not meet the captain's eyes. In that hesitation, the truth was laid bare. This Caribbean leader was indeed a hostage. He represented a nation that had flag independence but economic servitude. His tourism industry was owned by foreign corporations. His banking system was tethered to foreign central banks. His policies were dictated by the very institutions he was now trying to sell to Burkina Faso. He had come to Ouagadougou to offer partnership, but in reality, he was offering a mirror of his own chains. He was the house slave of the modern era, well-fed, well-spoken, but ultimately owned. And Traoré, the field slave, who had broken his shackles, was looking at him not with anger, but with a pity that burned worse than any insult. This was the moment the meeting ended. Not with a handshake, but with a realization. The envoy realized that his power was an illusion. Traoré realized that the West had run out of ideas. If this was their best move, to send a black face to sell a white man's agenda, then they truly did not understand the revolution that had taken hold in the Sahel. They were fighting a fire with a paper fan. This brings us to the core of the Ibrahim Traoré reaction. In the face of such a blatant attempt at manipulation, most leaders would have erupted. They would have banged the table, issued a press release, or stormed out to rally their base with fiery speeches. The Western media was waiting for exactly that. The angry African dictator trope. The emotional outburst they could mock in their headlines. But Traoré gave them nothing. His reaction was a masterclass in disciplined fury. He remained seated. His voice did not rise an octave. He treated the envoy with the polite distance one gives to a stranger who has walked into the wrong house. This calmness is his most dangerous weapon. It signals that he is not reacting to their provocations. He is operating on his own timeline. It signals that he does not seek their validation, and therefore, he does not fear their disapproval. Before we reveal the ultimatum that followed, which is perhaps the most powerful assertion of sovereignty you will ever hear, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member. Not for exclusive content or perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for the African Changes mission. Every member becomes a co-creator of the revolution we are documenting. Join us. Stand with the principle that African wealth belongs to Africa. With the brotherly mask stripped away, the envoy's tone shifted. The carrot of aid had been rejected. Now came the stick. The threats were subtle, woven into diplomatic language, but their meaning was unmistakable. "Captain," he said, his voice now cold and professional, "the international community is watching. Markets are sensitive. If you continue on this path, we cannot guarantee that your gold will find buyers. We cannot guarantee that essential medicines will reach your hospitals. We cannot guarantee that your neighbors will remain friendly." It was the classic playbook. Economic strangulation. Isolation. Destabilization. It was a promise of pain for the people of Burkina Faso. It was a test of Traoré's conscience. Are you willing to let your people suffer for the sake of pride? This is the trap they always set. They make dignity expensive. They make sovereignty painful. They count on the fact that eventually the leader will crack, or the people will turn on him when the shelves are empty. They were betting that Traoré was just another soldier who loved power more than he loved his country. But they miscalculated the mathematics of the Sahel. They forgot that these people have known suffering for decades under the old system. They forgot that pain is not new to them, but purpose is. Traoré listened to the threats. He listened to the list of calamities that would befall his nation. And then, he stood up. He walked to the window, looking out over the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, where young men and women were painting the tricolor flag on the walls, where the Ouagadougou roundabouts were filled with citizens guarding their own revolution. He turned back to the room, his silhouette framed by the harsh African sun. "You talk of markets," Traoré said. "You talk of buyers. You talk of what we will lose." He walked back to the table, leaning down so his face was level with the seated envoy. "But you have never asked what we have found. We have found that we can breathe without your permission. You threaten us with poverty? We have lived in poverty while you took our gold. You threaten us with war? We have known war while your soldiers watched. You threaten us with isolation? We are not isolated. We are returning to ourselves." The envoy began to gather his papers, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he had failed. He knew he had to report back to Paris and Washington that the Burkina Faso problem was not going away. But Traore was not finished. He had one final message to send back to the masters of the game. He didn't write it in a letter. He didn't speak it in a speech. He delivered it through an action so symbolic, so defiant, that it would leave the envoy and the world powers watching with a choice they never thought they would have to make. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an object. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a document. It was something small, heavy, and undeniably African. And as he placed it on the table between them, he said, "Take this back to them. Tell them this is the only thing they will ever get from Burkina Faso again." What was the object? And what was the devastating message it carried? A single nugget of raw gold. That was the object Ibrahim Traoré placed on the mahogany table. It sat there, small and unpolished, gleaming dully under the office lights. It was not a bar stamped with a foreign bank's logo. It was rough, jagged, straight from the red earth of the Sahel. It looked like a piece of the sun that had fallen to the ground. "Take this," Traoré repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more power than a shout. "Show them what they are really chasing. They want the gold. They want the cotton. They want the uranium. They can buy this nugget in the market, like anyone else. But tell them this: the hand that holds it and the land that birthed it are not for sale." The envoy stared at the gold. In that small rock lay the entire history of the conflict. For centuries, the relationship had been simple. Africa bleeds, the West feeds, the gold leaves, the holes remain. By placing that raw nugget on the table, Traoré was breaking the oldest rule of the empire. He was saying that the resources of Burkina Faso would no longer be the fuel for someone else's engine. They would be the foundation of his own nation's house. The meeting ended in silence. The envoy stood up, collected his folder, now useless, and left without a word. He walked out of the palace, past the guards who stood straighter than before, past the murals of Sankara, and into a car that would take him back to an airport, and then back to a world that was rapidly losing its grip. As the convoy sped away, the real storm began. We know what happened in the weeks that followed. The headlines in the Western press turned vicious. Suddenly, Traoré was no longer just a military leader. He was a threat to regional stability. The intelligence reports, the leaks, began to circulate, painting a picture of chaos in Ouagadougou. The economic pressure tightened. Ships carrying supplies were delayed. Banking transactions were flagged. This was the punishment. This was the darkness they had promised. But they forgot one thing. When you turn off the lights in a house, the people inside do not just sit in fear, they light their own fires. Instead of collapsing, Burkina Faso rallied. The sovereignty tax was paid not with resentment, but with pride. Citizens queued to donate to the war effort. Farmers worked harder. The darkness did not blind them. It forced them to see who their true friends were. It forced them to look not to Paris or Washington for salvation, but to each other. Now let us turn this story into a shared moment. Write in the comments where you are watching from. Your city, your country, your corner of the world. The African Change will read them with gratitude, and we send to each of you a heartfelt wish. May your journey be filled with dignity, hope, and light. This is more than a video. It is a gathering of voices across the globe. What we witnessed in that room was not just a diplomatic incident. It was a tectonic shift. For too long, the narrative of Africa has been written by those who held the pen, but not the pain. They told us that without their aid, we would starve. Without their soldiers, we would die. Without their approval, we would vanish. But look at the reality. The sky did not fall. The sun still rises over Ouagadougou. The markets are bustling, not with foreign charity, but with local trade. The factories are being built, brick by Burkinabè brick. They tried to bury Traoré. They tried to bury the revolution under sanctions and lies. But as the Mexican proverb says, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. The refusal to sign that document was the breaking of the shell. Now we are seeing the sprout. It is tender, yes. It is vulnerable to the storms, yes. But it is alive, and it is growing in its own soil, watered by the sweat of its own people, reaching for its own sun. This is the difference between independence given on a piece of paper and sovereignty seized with bare hands. This story is a reminder that dignity is not something you ask for. It is something you insist upon. It is the ability to look at a superpower with all its money and its fleets and say, no, not today, not ever again. Before we close, let us pause. What you have just heard is not simply an episode of history. It is a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still alive, waiting to be claimed. If this message has moved you, then subscribe to this channel, not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where voices of independence are honored, and where stories of pride continue to be told. By subscribing, you are not just supporting us, you are choosing to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's unfolding story. We started this story with anger at the audacity of a system that tries to buy nations like merchandise. We moved through regret, the sorrow for the leaders we lost, like Sankara, who stood alone. But we end here, not in darkness, but in blazing light. The fear is gone. The spell is broken. The partners, who came to dictate terms, have left with empty hands, and the people they underestimated are still standing. This entire sequence of events, the meeting, the offer, the rejection, will be remembered by history as a defining Ibrahim Traoré moment. It was the instant when the timeline shifted, when the old ways of doing business collided with a new, immovable force. Future generations will look back at the footage, at the transcripts, and they will study the Ibrahim Traoré moment, not just as political theater, but as the spark of a continental awakening. They will analyze the Ibrahim Traoré reaction, that calm, steely refusal to be intimidated, and they will see it as the blueprint for how to deal with neocolonialism. And they will understand that the second Ibrahim Traoré moment in that room, the placing of the gold on the table, was the true declaration of independence. The envoy has gone home. The folder is closed. But the question that Ibrahim Traoré asked that day still hangs in the air, drifting across borders and oceans, waiting for an answer from every one of us. He asked the envoy, and now history asks you, when the price is high, and the pressure is real, and the world tells you to kneel for safety, will you have the courage to stand for your own soul?